Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar. It happens here too, working with victim survivors of sexual exploitation and trafficking in rural communities. So we're happy to have you join us today. I'm going to get started by talking some about how to use Zoom. So Zoom is the platform that we're using for this webinar. So first of all, I'd like to start by saying that all of our phone lines are muted right now. At the end of the presentation, we'll have a Q&A session where we will unmute all of our lines so you can ask questions via your computer or a phone if that's how you're calling in today. Or you can also chat in your questions as well. So like I said, you can chat in your questions. So you can submit questions via the chat bar at any time during the webinar. Please know that we are going to leave a section at the end for time for questions. So when you are chatting in the questions, you can chat them in at any time, but we may not answer them while we're going through the webinar, but may wait to the end. If for some reason we're running out of time, we will compile all the questions that we have received and send them to you via email after the webinar. If you are asking a question that's kind of a clarifying question, we can certainly answer that as we're going through, just to make sure that we're being clear and you all understand what we're talking about. When we get to the part where we're going to unmute the lines for the Q&A, we ask that you please put your line on mute until you want to make a comment or ask a question. That way we don't get the background noise from people who are not talking. And then to mute your line when you are done, press *6. So if you're calling in via your phone, you'll want to press *7 to mute your line, to unmute your line, and *6 to mute your line. And please know that the webinar will be recorded and we will make the link available after the webinar. So we want to hear from you. If you could all chat in the chat function, if you could say your name, your organization, and what you hope to learn through this webinar. So at the bottom of your screen, you should see an icon for the chat function. So if you could go ahead and click on that and type in, and make sure when you're typing in that the drop-down menu that says to says all panelists and attendees. So again, please go ahead and type in your name, your organization, and what you hope to learn from this webinar. And while you're doing that, the presenters will go ahead and introduce ourselves. So my name is Ashley Stewart-Griffith, and I am the Advocacy Support Specialist at the Minnesota Coalition Against Sexual Assault. So what I do is I facilitate trainings, facilitate webinars, create resources, and facilitate connections between advocates. And I also answer technical assistance requests as well. I wanted to say, since we are talking about a rural specific webinar, I just wanted to say that, I grew up in a rural setting. I grew up in a town of about 60 people, and I had a pretty long bus to a nearby school. So I do understand some of the issues in rural settings. I do have a love for rural spaces as well. So I was really excited to do this webinar. While I haven't been an advocate in a rural setting, I know that I have a lot to learn, and I've learned a lot through this role too about the different strengths and challenges that rural advocates face. So we'll go ahead and Alan.
So my name is Alan Bakke. I'm the Southwest Minnesota Safe Harbor Regional Navigator at the Southwest Crisis Center. I always kid that such a long title, it does fit on a business card, but you have to write really small to get that there. I also grew up in a rural setting and actually serve in a rural setting, and have lived my entire life in a rural setting. I grew up in a small town that had a graduating class, and I was part of the larger graduating class of 28 people. So you knew everyone in the community. The town itself was a little bit larger than What's been talked about before was about 600, it's now 450. I live now down in southwest Minnesota, out in the country, and the nearest town is about 225 people in it. And I serve 17 counties in southwest Minnesota where the population of the entire county can be 5,000 people. So very rural setting.
I'm Sarah Floorman. I'm the Trafficking Policy Coordinator here at Mincasa. Prior to coming to Mincasa, I was working in the Safe Harbor service field. I was a program manager at a Safe Harbor shelter in the Twin Cities for about 2.5 years. So I've been doing Safe Harbor work for about 5 years now. Currently in my role, I work with teams across the state to develop local community-specific protocols to respond to youth that have been involved in sexual exploitation and trafficking. So I do a lot of work with multidisciplinary teams talking about how to improve their overall response and how to also identify and best serve these youth in their communities.
All right. So we had folks chat in their introductions.
Yeah, so we had Steph from Hands of Hope, hoping to learn something new about helping rural victims. And we had Aaron, an advocate at Bluff County Family Resources. They're located in a rural part of the state and looking forward to seeing what tools there are for geographically isolated victims. Thank you both. And folks, please feel free to continue chatting in your introductions.
Yeah, and so if we have anybody else that maybe you're all a little shy this morning, but if you get the courage to type in after going through the objectives, we can certainly come back and talk a little bit more about who's on the webinar. But thank you, Aaron and Steph. And yeah, we'll definitely spend some time talking about serving rural victim survivors. So now on to the objectives. So after this presentation, you will be able to describe the dynamics in the violence experienced by victim survivors of sex trafficking and exploitation in rural spaces. You will be able to identify victim survivors who may be experiencing sex trafficking and exploitation. You will be able to assess your services to sex trafficking and exploitation victim survivors. And lastly, be able to list resources available to sex trafficking and exploitation victim survivors. And I'd like to also say here that we will be talking about victim survivors of all ages, but we will spend some time talking about youth-focused pieces, and that's due to the age limit of Safe Harbor and also the recruitment tactics too that are specific to youth. So again, we really want to cast a broad net, talk about all victim survivors of all ages, but to know that some of the work has focused on youth victim survivors. Okay, and so if we could have you all just think a little bit about what are some of the strengths of rural communities. So I know that it looks like some folks here on the chat function have said that they are working in rural communities. And so what are some of the strengths that you're seeing? If you could type that in the chat function. And while you're typing that in, we're going to go through some other pieces and we'll come back to this question. So again, what are some strengths of rural communities?
So I always like to start my presentations with this little graphic here and an analogy of Star Trek. And it's not because I'm a Trekkie. I can't speak Klingon. I can't do that Vulcan greeting where you separate your fingers. And I don't know which episode was The Trouble with Tribbles, but I do remember the episode, but I can't tell you what it was. The reason why I like to do this, and you do have to kind of remember the time the Star Trek came out. It's pretty old, and it certainly has sexist language in here, and it's kind of geeky and stuff like that, but it's cool too. And it also kind of fits in with a little bit of the history and the movement of how we look at and address sex trafficking. So if you've watched Star Trek before, you probably can even say these words, or at least remember this is the opening lines, that these are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise. Its 5-year mission to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations, to boldly go where no man has gone before. That really does have some similarities with what's going on in the whole movement of sex trafficking and exploitation. If you think back to from where we came from, this is a whole new world in terms of our view and our concept of what exploitation and sex trafficking is. And it really is kind of a new world, a new civilization. And for me, one of the signature pieces of legislation that really kind of sets up this whole new world is the Trafficking Victim Protection Act of year 2000, and then of course its subsequent reauthorizations. What's really interesting about this is that previous to that, we looked at someone who was engaged in sexual activity and we labeled them, and still do this, but we labeled them prostitutes and we considered it criminal behavior. Certainly there were others who didn't see it that way, but as a systems, that's the way that we looked at it. But as more was learned about the dynamics of sex trafficking and exploitation, the dialogue began to start looking at how people are exploited and how people are victimized. And the TVPA in 2000 really started to create an ideological shift in how we look at this situation, and prepare us to actually be in Minnesota, getting us into the safe harbor legislation. So in Minnesota, while dialogue were beginning on local levels, within the legislature and within the state, things really didn't start taking place till the year 2005. And in that time, Minnesota starts passing anti-trafficking laws. The dialogue continues to go on of what this is going to look like and how are we going to address the situation and how are we going to develop both state response and then also individualized response. And things really start to percolate over the years. And in 2011, Minnesota becomes one of what are now about 30 states who becomes a safe harbor state, and they enact safe harbor laws. During that time, then, in the legislature, they added the definition of sexually exploited youth in Minnesota's child protection codes. They increased penalties against commercial sex purchasers, and they directed the Commissioner of Public Safety, and I really like that. I'm going to talk about that more, about public safety. We're starting to see this as a public health concern. But they directed the Commissioner of Public Safety to work with stakeholders to create victim-centered statewide response for sexually exploited youth. It is a bold new world that we were never at before. From 2011, it moves on again to 2014, and the Safe Harbor law takes effect August 1st, 2014. It excluded sexually exploited youth under 18 from the definition of delinquent children, which is really great. We're no longer labeling somebody as delinquent, but seeing that they have been exploited and are victims of somebody else's power and control. With this change in law, new models and resources are really being made available to help people victimized by sex trafficking. So we're instead of penalizing people, we're starting to look at how can we help people who have been in those situations. And in 2016, Safe Harbor services were made available to individuals who are 24 and younger, which is really great because we see that it isn't just at 18 that as if you switch a light switch that all of a sudden a person can make this choice. It isn't about choice, but it's really about the sense that there is a history of things that may have led to exploitation, and to put that person in a vulnerable situation where somebody could take advantage and be able to manipulate and control them. And so seeing that, we know that as a community and as a state, we need to be able to provide resources that go beyond to those of a minor.
Okay, so Now I'm going to spend some time talking about strengths and shadows of rural spaces. And it looks like we don't have any answers for what are some strengths of rural communities. And that's okay to be a little shy. I do just want folks to know that it is a small group. So if some of you are intimidated to put yourself out there and type something in, please know that it's just a small group. Oftentimes with our webinars, folks are busy, so they're hoping to catch the recording. So just know that it's a small group, and please feel free to be bold and participate via the chat function. So I wanted to really ground ourselves in what it's like to live and to work in rural spaces. To really think about strengths and shadows and how they apply to both serving victim survivors of trafficking and exploitation, and what it may be like to be a victim survivor of trafficking and exploitation in a rural space. So some of the strengths and shadows are unique to rural spaces. Some exist also in urban spaces, and some of the same issues exist in rural and urban spaces, but may look different based on the unique dynamics. Yeah, so the first one that we're going to talk about is a sense of community. So, and I guess, sorry, I was going to say that I got this list after just kind of perusing some articles about what it's the specific dynamics of rural communities, and also kind of reflecting on some of the things that I've heard from advocates across the state who are working in rural communities as well. So the first is a sense of community. So folks in the community may know each other, maybe working in the same areas, children may go to the same school. There may be only one school in the district, or sorry, in the community. And so there is kind of a tight-knit sense of community. But that being said, it might be hard to reach out for help because anonymity decreases. And people may kind of know your business more if you reach out for help, or victim survivors may know the advocates who are working in the community. And the next is a defined community. So in rural spaces, you may know who your community is. It's really the folks who are around you, who you're spending time with. You really can't change who that community is. Whereas in highly urban areas, there are more people, more areas that you may be able to kind of self-select who your community is. I think a good example of this is when one is in, like when I was growing up and going to school, I had a very small class, not 28 people, but it was smaller. I think I had a graduating class of like 62 people. So I really didn't have a lot of options for like who my friends were in the small community. But at the same time, that did kind of teach me to know how to get along with people who had different values than I did and had different political ideologies than I did. Whereas now, being in more of an urban setting, very, very highly populated area, I can kind of select who my friends are, who I hang out with. And that's both a strength and a shadow. And rural communities can't necessarily select your community as much. Next is high investment. So people in rural communities may be more invested in that community. That's why sometimes when you see like a natural disaster happen in a community, folks are rallying around those who are affected, or any other tragic circumstance that happens. You may see that more than in urban spaces. That being said, there may be folks in the community who do have a high investment in the community, but also want to see the community through their eyes and see changes and initiatives be made based on what they value, and not be open to change or other progressive ideas. And maybe less in terms of trafficking and exploitation, maybe less likely to acknowledge that it is something that's happening in their community, and maybe not want to admit the realities and the dark sides of their community. Lastly is self-sufficiency. So we see this more in rural communities, that folks are willing to kind of take care of their own, whether that's their own family, their own neighborhood. But that can also hinder folks from reaching out for help when they need to, and to be looking to outside resources. So these are some of the unique strengths and shadows of rural spaces that really want to ground us in as we move forward and talk more about trafficking and exploitation in rural spaces.
Okay, so this is where it gets interesting. Sexual exploitation is a really broad term. In Minnesota, when we are talking about sexual exploitation, we're really talking specifically about commercial sexual exploitation. And that is exploitation that occurs when anything of value, or a promise of anything of value, is given to a person by any means in exchange for any type of sexual activity. A third party may or may not be involved. So exploitation is kind of the large umbrella term. Trafficking is a type of exploitation. According to Minnesota law, we define sex trafficking as the receiving, recruiting, enticing, harboring, providing, or obtaining by any means an individual to aid in the prostitution of the individual, or receiving profit or anything of value, knowing or having reason to know it is derived from trafficking. So when we're talking about sexual exploitation, it can involve a variety of things like survival sex, which is engaging in sexual activity to meet basic needs. So if someone who is homeless, or their living situation is unstable, or they are hungry, engages in sexual activity to have a place to stay or something to eat, that counts as sexual exploitation. Trafficking is when you have that third party facilitator. So survival sex is not trafficking, survival sex is exploitation. Both are bad. They just have different words. It's confusing and strange, and this image makes it look simple. And sometimes it seems as though the differences are clear cut, but they are not always. When you're talking about a third party trafficker, you're talking about what is commonly known as a pimp, or might involve a facilitator who's maybe posting online ads for you or transporting you, that type of thing. Sometimes the differences between exploitation and trafficking can be really gray, and that's one of the many fun nuances of this particular issue, particularly when it comes to child protection investigations. So if you ever want to talk about that, please feel free to email me. We'll talk about that another time.
All right, so another question for you, and again, encouraging you all to be bold. So where do young people in your community connect? So if you could type in the chat function, kind of think about your community and where you're seeing young people in your community connect. So we'll go through some more slides, and then we'll actually come back to this and see what your answers are. Thank you.
So we kind of want to take a look at now, how does it happen? I've been a regional navigator for about 2.5 years, and I remember some of the early videos that were produced and the early messaging and trainings that were put out used a mnemonic device called the 4 T's of trafficking. And I like to use this, even though it's a little older, I guess, and we've moved on from that, but there's some things in here that are kind of work well with this whole sense of recruitment. In those 4 T's of trafficking, Safe Harbor had talked about, one of the T's was targeting. Taking a look and finding traffickers look for people with vulnerabilities that they can exploit. Once they have worked on that target, they start to trick them. They lure them through promises of work or benefits. They make promises that they have no intention of holding up, to be able to groom that person and develop a relationship with them. It then moves on to a third T of being turned, and a fourth T when we get into a little bit later of being traumatized. But right now I want to take a look at those kind of first two T's, that targeting and tricking. So some common methods of recruitment you see on your screen really take a look at reaching out to youth in various ways. And in a rural setting, what I've really seen a real rise in is that social media and online solicitations. And it can happen in such a, what looks to be an innocent way, but is really quite covert and deceiving by the trafficker. A number of youth that I've worked with gotten into music chat lines, expressing their interest about various different genres of music and things that they're socially speaking out about. And of course, that trafficker is also looking at those things and on there as well, and can start developing a conversation and a relationship that seems to be one that's up and above board, but was really in that grooming process of tricking that person. So you build that relationship over time, someone involved in their life. But it's not just social media and online and some trafficker who may be at a distant location. So other methods of recruitment can be familial members. It could be a partner, a boyfriend or a girlfriend as well. There can also be initiation things where people get into a situation that can be recruited, such as working as a dancer in a strip club. But in all of these situations, something that is in common is really that part of targeting someone and then tricking them, luring them through promises of works or benefits. It then moves into that next stage, that next T, where you're really starting to turn them and then moving into traumatize them. The way that you do that is really manipulating that relationship that you've built. You start to isolate that person from the strengths and the resources that they might have had. And if you think in a rural setting, some of those strengths have been that sense of community that is there. But in the situation with the trafficker, they start to say, those people aren't there thinking of your good health. They start to say negative things about them. There are people who are actually trying to control you, when in fact, it may be just the opposite that's taking place. The trafficker is trying to control them. Other ways that the trafficker will initiate and break that person, the way that they will start to turn them, is by really taking away their sense of identity. They move away in that part of isolation. They may give the person a new name and identity. They may even use branding or tattooing to reinforce that old life is behind you and this is your new life. Blackmail is a big thing. How would you like to have a situation where whatever you have done is now made public, especially in that small town or in that graduating class of 60 people, to know that you have been exchanging sex for money, or that you've been sending nude pictures. So there's that sense that you're going to really hold something in control for that person that would be devastating for them. It can become even worse. There can be exploitation and trauma. There could be criminal prosecution or deportation. There can be some very physical things that go on. Also, inducing or enabling a chemical addiction has been part of initiating breaking. But anything that will be able to solidify that power and control and that fear that if these things ever came out, your life would be over. It continues to escalate. Methods of control. The traffickers will use a continued use of breaking techniques. They will make an example out of another person and say, if you don't do as I say, this same thing will happen to you. Another thing can be causing exploiting a pregnancy. And here you have this life that is near and dear to you as a child, maybe in that situation, the only one that you feel that you're connected to, and the trafficker will say, I control that child as well. How would you like it if I just left with that child? And what will you do about it? There's a pressure and guilt by playing that friendship boyfriend card, and I think that in any times in life we can fall into those traps. by saying something like, well, if you really cared for me, or if you really loved me, you would. And so you coerce that person. So there are many different ways, and when it gets into that methods of control, again, they become escalated. They can become far more social, emotional, and physically detrimental to that person.
So you might be wondering, who are the folks who are buying sex? There was a report issued by the University of Minnesota's Robert Jones Urban Research and Outreach Engagement Center, also known as UROC, called Mapping the Demand, that focuses on looking at sex buyers in the state of Minnesota. The citation is at the bottom if you are interested in looking up that paper. It's really interesting. What they discovered is that in Minnesota, the majority of buyers are white married men. They are middle to upper middle class. They are respected and influential people. How many news stories have you heard where the local city councilman was discovered to be buying sex? Another thing that's really important is that folks aren't buying sex where they live. They are often traveling an average of 30 to 60 miles. And that kind of falls into something we'll talk about in a little bit, which is when sex trafficking happens and when people are buying sex and the types of situations that come up. But folks are not buying sex from their next door neighbor. They are looking for it elsewhere.
If I could jump in for just a second, all the things that you brought up there, as you know, in terms of who the buyers are. I participate in a lot of sting operations throughout my territory, and every bullet point that you have up there and the others that you talked about are really true about that. Especially in rural Minnesota, where the populations aren't as diverse. It really is white married men. And whenever I do presentations, because when I look at those characteristics, it's like, oh, I guess this could be me. I fit into those. And so I'll often have people, you know, stand up and say, if this characteristic fits you, please stand up and remain standing until we're down, you know, to the end. And of course, I'll then say, oh, now please sit down because now I'm going to ask you, have you purchased sex? But the characteristics are there. And the sting operations over and over and over again fit all of those dynamics.
We do have some answers about where Youth Connect, if you wanted to read those.
Yeah, so Erin responded, churches, school events, local swimming pool, and movie theater are all places in the community where young people connect. Steph also brought it up that even in smaller communities, they may not have those community centers or movie theaters around, so that in those communities, kids are connecting at homes, fish houses, anywhere without adults around.
Yep, absolutely.
Thank you guys for those responses.
Yep. The reason we're primarily focusing on youth in terms of the early stages in recruitment is that most folks who are involved in trafficking were recruited as youth. The average age is about 14 to 16 for the point of entry. And that number changes depending on the data that you look at, but the average is about 14 to 16. So traffickers are going to those places. They're finding where are youth hanging out together without their parents, and they are targeting youth in those areas. So you will see folks at malls or community centers. That is where recruiting takes place. Fish houses are absolutely a thing. When talking about trafficking and exploitation, where does it happen? A lot of times people talk about the street level trafficking because that's kind of the stereotype that we've all been brought up to understand. And it's also the thing that leads some folks to believe that sex trafficking is a metro problem only. However, street level is actually not anywhere near the largest kind of area in which you see trafficking occurring. It's happening a lot at hotels and motels. It's happening online more and more every day. Strip clubs, truck stops on interstates, massage parlors, which are becoming more and more common in suburban and rural areas. And another thing that I think people believe sometimes based on some of the media representation is that things like events like the Super Bowl or the Final Four are giant trafficking extravaganzas where it happens more than any other time. And that's not entirely the case. You will find there is about as much trafficking during the Super Bowl as there is at any other time. The difference is that there are more people in one space and they're coming from out of town. The place where you are going to see a ton of trafficking that is really unexpected, I think, for a lot of folks, is places like resorts and hunting lodges. This can particularly be an issue because they tend to be places where men gather in groups, and groups of men are more likely to do destructive things like buy sex than mixed groups. It is what it is. Alan, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, I do.
Sure.
Though I keep thinking as you were saying that, which is everything was true, and it's like I'm going on vacation fishing next week or at the end of this week, and it's like with a group of men. But it is interesting. The very first time that our group had gone fishing, this is back 25 years ago, we were actually in a situation where at a resort where a person was being solicited. And this was way before I've ever got into this, and my eyes were wide open and going and very naive and thinking, what world, how is this happening? But it's there because again, you're in that sense of I'm far away from home. I was hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles away from home. There's no accountability or responsibility or less of it there. So it becomes something that a trafficker will actually use to exploit with men as well.
Mm-hmm.
Wanted to kind of talk a bit about a couple of the other bubbles in terms of where it fits into with the rural setting that I'm at. In the decline of rural Minnesota, you will often see different businesses that do pop up. In fact, in the little town that I grew up, there was this wonderful, wonderful big restaurant. It served the best beef commercials and turkey commercials. I loved it. It was great. I moved out of that town years later. It had closed, the restaurant had closed down, and lo and behold, the strip club came in there. It was a place where wasn't that far out of the cities from some population bases. It was kind of anonymous being in this small little town, and somebody saw an opportunity to be able to make some money there. The other part, a growing business in rural Minnesota has been massage parlors. So we've had a couple of sting operations that have shut down some massage parlors and have their ongoing investigations and charges against traffickers there. Strip clubs are really in rural Minnesota, at least in my area, have been replaced by the massage parlors. And then just one other thing about the online ads. When we think about online ads, what usually comes to mind is Craigslist and Backpage. And of course, with Backpage.com being shut down and Craigslist voluntarily taking away their personals, you would think that the avenue is not there. Well, very crafty and very I guess ever inventing themselves, traffickers will find different ways and get around that. On Craigslist, it's still there. But the other growing thing in terms of kind of an online recruitment and online trafficking is through different apps that are available out there. So apps have kind of not necessarily replaced all online ads, but it's another subset of that online activity for trafficking.
Yes, absolutely. And when we're talking about online, in particular recruitment, another area people don't always think about, because I think social media comes up a lot, but there are also a number of online games with chat functions, and people in these gaming communities interact with one another just like they do on social media. That is a place where traffickers hang out looking for youth. One thing I wanted to mention in addition about where does trafficking happen is the upcoming oil pipeline project. So northern Minnesota is going to be seeing this oil pipeline being built. As you may know, in North Dakota, they've been doing, over the last several years, there's been oil fracking going on. And with that came a lot of workers from out of the area. So huge influx of people primarily men, but again, it's an equal opportunity thing. Buying sex can be any gender. But they did see an increase in trafficking and exploitation, and they did see a lot more victim survivors coming forward following these projects. And that is something that absolutely can happen. You may have heard the term man camp, which is just kind of a fancy way of saying this is where we temporarily house the workers who are working on the pipeline, because they are from out of town, they're not from those areas. And again, that's another place where you have groups of people who are unsupervised, out of town, finding ways to entertain themselves. And I think a lot of times being on vacation or being in a place that's not your home, there is a freedom to do things you wouldn't otherwise do if you felt like you might get caught.
So let's take a look at some of the characteristics of traffickers in Minnesota. Traffickers are really another subset of the exploiters in there. They're usually motivated by a deep desire for money and also the need to control other people, especially vulnerable people. They might have ties to gangs and organized crime. I don't really see a lot of that in the rural area, the rural setting that I am. Isn't to say that it doesn't exist, but that isn't the main model that's out there. The variety of different business models they have really come in through those massage parlors, really come in through that aspect of having some type of business that might be there. In regards to the pipelines too, in rural Minnesota, it becomes literally a pipeline. The traffickers will be making stops and setting them up along the way as they move to these man camps. And so as they traverse through rural Minnesota, whether it be from, Chicago has been one of the pipeline areas of transient traffickers back and forth, you'll see that as a business model. In Southwest Minnesota, another one that's actually quite large is a familial connection. You will hear a lot of situations of their aunts or their grandmothers or mothers who have been in the business, and so it becomes the family business that is being handed down to the children, maybe as a form of survival sex, being able to, in that highly impoverished area, being able to make ends meet, but traffickers will prey upon that and make these connections to that familial situation. Oops. So understanding a survivor's mindset. I get this so often when I'm doing trainings and presentations, when you talk about the trauma that is experienced by someone who has been trafficked, and the question is always, why do youth do this, or why does it continue to happen? Why don't they leave? Why don't they run away? We have those discussions too, the same questions in terms with any victim of domestic violence or sexual violence. People not in that life or not used to working in that setting don't quite understand it. But when you take a look at a survivor's mindset, most people don't see themselves as victims. They'll see themselves in a relationship with their exploiter. They often refer to them as their boyfriend or their partner. And so they don't see themselves as a victim and that person is a trafficker. But they have to do what a person's got to do to survive, can be some of the language that is said. Often fearful and distrustful of system professionals because they may have gone through the system and they may have been let down there. There is a frequency of people who have youth who have run away or who have gone through foster care system or have been in law enforcement working with in probation, that those systems have been for them very intimidating, that they have been systems that have been harsh to them in their perception, and that they have that innate or that instinct of fear and distrust of them. Some of the things that I really like to bring out when I do presentations is talking about exactly what that trauma is and how that actually is part of their mindset. The trauma really affects people in about like 5 different categories. It has a spiritual impact, it has a physical impact, it has a social impact, isolations from peer group, and if they're still in school, that sense of that part of being truant and being missing school and disconnected from their systems of support. It has that emotional impact of a deep pain or grieving, and its feelings of humiliation and shame. And so all of the, and then it also has psychological emotional impact, post-traumatic stress disorder. And so with all of that going on as a reaction or as a living in that trauma, the trafficker is able to really be able to exploit that. Another part that ends up happening quite often in, I would say, I hate to say always and never, but almost always in every situation that I've been in, that drugs often play a role in sex trafficking, whether it be as a coping mechanism or as a way for the trafficker to continue to be able to have a control and a means of keeping that person under their control.
All right, so another question for you. So if you could type in the chat function, what might be some factors contributing to someone being vulnerable to trafficking in rural communities? So again, what might be some factors contributing to someone being vulnerable to trafficking in rural communities?
All right, while you're answering that, you might also be asking yourself, how the heck do I identify these folks? Especially if they're not coming out and self-identifying. There are some common red flags. A report, again, listed at the bottom of this slide, recently came out talking about the perceptions of human trafficking in the Midwest. They identified the top 5 warning signs for sex trafficking, and they are the same across regions. So they're the same in rural, suburban, and urban spaces. Sexual assault is huge. A history of sexual assault, whether it be current or past. Mental health concerns, drug and alcohol abuse or overdose, chronic runaways, so folks who are housing unstable, and then untreated STIs, which are something that come up fairly regularly with folks being trafficked, and is something that might not always occur to people as a warning sign. So these are some red flags. There may be folks being trafficked or exploited that don't have any of these red flags. There's also quite a lot of people who have these issues who are not being trafficked. So just know this isn't a be all end all. Some other red flags that are kind of more commonly known are things like having money or phones or other items of value that they can't explain how they got. So if they suddenly have things that they normally wouldn't be able to afford to buy. If they've got sexually explicit material online, if they're posting suggestive photos on their social media, etc. And then another key piece, especially for youth, is if they're in a relationship with an older partner and they're not really willing to talk too much about that partner or reveal identifying information, if they are kind of shady about what age that person is, etc. Those are some red flags that come up.
One of the things that I can jump into, that when I'm doing training, especially with law enforcement's really gotten great, I guess, at being able to recognize the signs of various different crimes, especially if it's a drug related crime. They have worked in that environment so long and they see those signs. But for exploitation and sex trafficking, not all officers have been trained in that. So one of the things that I often will tell them, as well as other system professionals, and I guess anyone, is this, using the analogy, have you ever been walking along or driving your car along, and out of your corner of your eye, you see something, and something registers in your mind. You're not quite sure what it was, but you have a concept of what it was. And you often, then kind of say, okay, that's what it was. But if you were to actually turn around and take a closer look and stop and actually look more closely at what those signs were, what those things, would your determination of that thing that you thought it was be the same, or would it be different? So whenever these red flags come up, we kind of have this kind of gut reaction that something's there. I'm not quite sure what it is, but if you slow down, stop, and start looking at them in context, all of them together, and how it might be out of the ordinary, that's when this may be something beyond what they are by themselves.
All right. So there are a number of risk factors that make people vulnerable to being exploited or trafficked. Again, we are talking primarily about youth because recruitment tends to start during that age period. However, a lot of these factors, they apply to everyone. Anyone can be recruited into exploitation and trafficking, anyone of any gender, any ethnicity, any age, any socioeconomic class. Although the highest percentage of victims of exploitation and trafficking, particularly of youth, tend to be girls of color from poor communities, young people of all kinds are susceptible to this. I think one of the things that we don't talk about enough is the vulnerability of simply being an adolescent. Your brain chemistry is all over the place, your hormones are all over the place. It is the worst time of most people's lives, even when things are going relatively well for them. There tend to be self-esteem issues and those needs and desires to be cared for. And all of those make young people vulnerable.
We do have a couple of answers to the question.
Awesome.
Yeah, so staff responded with lack of supervision and parental involvement, also low self-esteem, starving for attention. And then Erin also mentioned unstable homes, runaways, and a history of sexual assault.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, I think, you know, the risk factors, again, these are things that are universal. They're seen across populations, rural, suburban, and urban. Folks are at risk regardless of where they live. And those risk factors sometimes tend to mirror those red flags a little bit. History of abuse in the family. Having a history of being physically, sexually, or emotionally abused can make a person more vulnerable to being recruited. Family instability or dysfunction. Yeah, if you don't have a supportive family situation, if you feel isolated in some way, that can be a huge issue. Running away from home or housing instability. You know, you don't see a lot of homelessness that's very visible in rural areas because there are not a lot of, you know, tent communities popping up in rural spaces, but folks are, a lot of times, youth are couch hopping. And if they're still going to school and acting as though things are normal, people aren't usually aware that there's maybe a housing situation going on. And maybe that person is couch hopping and maybe that person is exchanging sexual favors in order to have that place to stay. And addiction is also another issue. If you have a chemical addiction, that is something of value that you are hoping to procure. If you don't have a lot of money, it's absolutely a norm in a lot of communities to exchange sex or sexual activity for drugs or alcohol. And that's something that comes up a lot. There's a number of other risk factors, and a lot of them are the kinds of things that you all talked about, as well as just kind of some sort of typical things that you will see for folks who are maybe easily influenced by others. Poverty, there's, you know, the need for money or the need for essential items. Lack of support, so those situations, like you mentioned, where there weren't family members involved. Parent or guardian with addiction or parent or guardian out of the home. That history of out-of-home placement is a huge risk factor. Oppressed populations are always more vulnerable. Traffickers will spot people who they feel don't have as many resources, maybe have more needs. Family member involvement, again, school dropout. If you don't have something else occupying your time, if you don't have another way of potentially making income or one day earning income, that can make you vulnerable. Emotional distress. So again, this is another huge problem with youth in general. It's just really hard to be a young person. And if you are going through some family trauma or some other things in your life, that makes you vulnerable to predators. And then there's immigration status. So this can come up a lot of times, especially in communities that have a lot of migrant work or factory work. When you have someone without a legal residency status, it can be really easy to exert control and power over that person, particularly if it's somebody who, I've lost my words. Alan. Well,
that happens to me all the time. So
all right.
I usually end up having another word that I'll figure out. But in terms of immigration status, I also am the navigator for our labor trafficking, and there's a real overlap and intersection between sex trafficking and labor trafficking, because in that situation you are, as you're talking about, highly vulnerable, especially if you are an undocumented immigrant, or if a person holds those documents from you, whether they be legal or whether they be forged, that they have that ability to be able to say, you know, you could be deported at any time. I actually I control your life. You will do for me what I want you to do, or pay the consequences.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. There is also some understanding that rural youth, and this came out of a Minnesota student survey, they've recently added some questions related to trafficking. And rural youth have responded far higher than urban populations to have a perception of isolation and a sense that there are less people surrounding them that care about them. And that kind of comes up when we were talking about strengths and shadows of rural spaces. If you have a strong sense of community, that can be a real positive. But if you are not feeling like you're connected to that community, if you're not feeling that you're a part of that community, that can actually make things quite a bit worse for you.
Intersections of violence. So trafficking and exploitation intersect with other forms of violence, and so you as an advocate will likely encounter victim survivors who are experiencing multiple forms of violence. So they may present issues of sexual violence, domestic violence, or child abuse, but at the same time may be experiencing trafficking and exploitation. This is important to know because a victim survivor will not say, I'm experiencing sex trafficking and exploitation. What services do you have?
Not so much, no.
Yes. So it is important for us to understand the connections and how these overlap. So for example, when I was a very new advocate, I had a client who came to organization looking for domestic violence services. And when she described the abuse that she was experiencing, she said that her husband was forcing her to dance, which is what she referred to as stripping, and that he would force her to dance and then take her money, all of the money that she made after dancing, and oftentimes there was violence associated with how he was taking that money from her. So this is certainly an example of exploitation, and had I been more keen to that situation, I would have probably asked better questions to learn more about that situation and to kind of uncover if there had actually been trafficking going on. So was her husband working at the club and facilitating these connections? Was he forcing her to do more than dance with folks? So just kind of wanting to learn more about that situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so now when I look at that situation, I understand the dynamics of abuse as exploitation. And I also would understand and maybe be a little more looking at the situation, knowing that many victim survivors view their trafficker, or their trafficker is their significant other. Another thing to think about too is that some of the risk factors that Sarah had mentioned, mentioning that the #1 risk factor for trafficking is sexual assault. So having previous sexual assault in their history is a definite risk factor. And these are definitely folks that you're seeing as a sexual assault advocate. We're also looking at child abuse and neglect cases as well. So if your organization is serving youth who are involved in the child protection system, or even parents too who are involved in the child protection system, also looking at some of those risk factors for trafficking that Sarah mentioned. So folks with unstable homes are more likely to be involved in a child protection system, as well as parents and guardians who have addiction. So again, when we're looking at all of these forms of violence, they really intersect, and it can be, sometimes you can't really peel these apart. So as an advocate, it's important to understand how all these intersect and how you could be on the lookout for experiences or dynamics of trafficking and exploitation.
So we want to kind of change gears a little bit. We talked about, from the beginning of this, kind of the history, the evolution, the mind shift in terms of looking at people who are engaged in sexual activity in exchange for money as being, or something of value as being people who are exploited or victims. We talked about some of these risk factors and things to be looking at to see how we might be able to respond and provide services to them. But we want to really then kind of talk about the approach. How do you do that? Because as Ashley said, nobody, and while I haven't been doing this forever, only 2.5 years, I have yet to have somebody come up and say, hey, Alan, I have been sexually exploited or sex trafficked, and I understand that as a regional navigator, you can connect me to resources.
You don't have that happening?
No, it just hasn't happened yet. So the approach really needs to be key. And the approach, it boils down to building a relationship. And how do we actually build that relationship? The first thing I really kind of take a look at is that when working with sexually exploited and trafficked youth, we really need to be mindful of that approach where we create a safe space. If meeting in person, is that space a safe and calming place for them? You think about youth coming through the system, and one of the first places might be in a interrogation room, so to speak, through law enforcement.
Or juvenile detention center.
Or a juvenile detention center. Definitely not exactly a safe space. I don't think that in any of those environments I'd be willing to then say, hey, yeah, and I've been sexually exploited or trafficked myself too. You're going to withhold information. You're going to be defiant because you're very intimidated, and it becomes that kind of fight, flight, freeze type situation. Also looking at the cultural competency. When you're working with someone who has possibly been exploited or trafficked, do you know how cultural experiences shape them? And not just talking about culture in terms of race and ethnicity, but also there's a youth culture. We need to take a look at what is the culture that we're involved in. There is a rural culture that is very different, as we've been talking about, than an urban setting. So understanding what are those environmental factors that are going on. And then I really think that it's kind of recognize your own capacity. First thing is, don't promise them things that you can't deliver on, and give them information that's not factual. I always believe the best thing to do is create that sense of disarming of yourself by saying, I don't know all the answers right up front. In fact, there's a lot of things I don't know. But I'm willing to walk through this journey with you to figure out what some possible options are for you in this situation. I am connected with a number of different resources because of the Safe Harbor program, and we can talk about what those might look like in your life and what you're particularly needing. And again, I don't know all the answers, but I'm willing to walk with you in that journey. Approach with a sense of humility, not as someone, we think of the language that is still permeates it, that we're out there to rescue people. talk about an arrogant situation, that we actually think that we have that power to do that, and to
And
be
that
actually
people want
judging
that.
them that they're needing to be
Mhm.
rescued. It's kind of crazy, but to come with a sense of humility and just be authentic in there. And really then know what services are available for youth in your area and how to make those referrals. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a whole rural setting of what those services might look like. But it becomes one of those things that it behooves us to really understand what is available, whether it's kind of within traditional settings or looking outside of the box. So if we know those resources, it makes a big difference. And then it's really about meeting them where they're at. Recognize that they're more than just a victim of exploitation. It becomes one of those things we tend to categorize and label people. A person is a victim, a person is a survivor. And those may definitely be true. They may be those things at both at the same time, but that is their determination, not our determination to label somebody where they're at. So really recognize them and meet them where they're at. It's important to be comfortable with the language that they use as well. One of the things that I always suggest when I'm working with law enforcement, probation, is to actually mirror that language, not to refute it. If they're referring to their exploiter or trafficker as their partner or their boyfriend, it doesn't gain you anything to say, no, they're their trafficker, but to be able to use that same language until they're able and wanting to actually change that language through the relationship that you have and the resources that you make available and how they evolve in that whole sense of recognizing where they might be at.
You may be working with a victim survivor of exploitation and trafficking and never use the words exploitation or trafficking during conversations with them.
Never.
Because that isn't how they view the situation.
And I think it's really also good in the sense of approach is to really kind of understand that stages of change model. Really take a look at those aspects of a pre-contemplation, a contemplation, a preparation, action, a maintenance, a relapse, and how this becomes a circular thing as well. And if you're not familiar with that, just kind of look up stages of change model. But I always give the example for myself. Right now, I am in kind of an extreme exercise plan, getting ready for a big bicycle trip in South Dakota. But there was a part where I wasn't even acknowledging that I needed to get in shape. It wasn't a thing for me, especially when I was younger. When I was far more active, I wouldn't be thinking of myself as needing to get in shape. And the people that we work with may not be thinking that they're needing to be rescued in any single way. So really understand that part, that it's a process for a person to move through those stages of change. And then as service providers, we also need to know, just like in my example of exercising, I have a relapse. I did not, exercise today, and maybe I won't tomorrow. And when I'm going to be fishing next week, I'm not going to be doing that. So there's going to be that part where we will start to relapse. And should we expect anything different from someone who's been highly traumatized? That they may see that the situation that they're in is better than facing some of those changes that could take place and the uncertainty that's there. So they may even decide to go back into that life or to see that relationship as being the best relationship for them. So I think the approach needs to be built on those aspects. And above all, as a service provider, connect on a human level and just be authentic of who you are. So, starting the conversation. This is always one of the things that can be very difficult for us. I don't know about you, but I grew up in a household that we didn't talk about sex, any of those types of things going on. So, to actually talk, or did we talk about abuse and exploitation? And so having those conversations can be difficult for us. They may not be part of our common parlance. So, in starting that conversation, it's really best to just kind of begin without just grilling a person and really about building that relationship. Depending on how they present themselves, you might say something like, I'm getting the perception, it seems that you might be scared. Can you describe, if that feeling is what you're experiencing or what's going on right now? And as they talk about that description, can you tell me more about what prompted you to do that or to think that? What's kind of going on? Where are they at in this? Also, in terms of if they talk about things of being a choice, you might say, what did you think would have happened if you had made a different choice? Were there other choices available to you? So that you can see that you're really interested in that person. So that becomes a good way of just kind of starting the conversation. When you get into that, you can kind of then start working your way up. More initial questions could be something like, I don't know what it's like myself, but I can only imagine that it must be tough to be out there on your own. How was it that you were able to survive? What were the things that were available to you? What did you do when you needed money? And to be talking about those things.
To really normalize that experience for them.
Definitely. So this brings us down to, as we're kind of getting near the end of this, I think we got, about 20 minutes left, I think. And we, again, want to open it up to your thoughts and the things that you've been putting forward in the chats. But it really comes down to that part about how do we build our response, especially in a rural setting. How do we go about doing that? There are kind of 4 different areas, and we're talking about knowing the issues in history. Context is everything. To be able to understand what is the issue and then what is that environment like where you're at. Becoming educated as much as we can in terms of the dynamics of sex trafficking and exploitation. Understand those characteristics of human trafficking as we've been talking about here, the red flags, the risk factors, the vulnerabilities, how all those things contribute to it, and just kind of the air that we breathe. I'll put it out there. I definitely understand and experience the benefits of white male privilege and understand that we need as a society to address those issues, and those become part of the characteristics of human trafficking too, especially on that demand side. Understand and implement your policies. How are you going to respond? How as an agency are you going to be able to reach out and to provide services? What is that model going to look like? Who are the people who are going to be involved? When do you refer and hand off? What things can you directly do? How do you then also contact the appropriate resources? Small communities, while they may not be on every street corner, there are resources there that aren't always in the form of the nonprofits, like the agency that I work for, the Southwest Crisis Center, and we work with people who are experiencing domestic sexual violence, exploitation, and trafficking, and we have resources available to us. But there are other resources available there that don't come in the form of social service agencies or come in the form of a nonprofit. It could be faith-based resources. It also could be some different wraparound ancillary services that are out there. So know what they are and be able to contact the appropriate resource for the appropriate situation that that person might be in.
I will drive over the speed limit for this so we get time for questions. So we're thinking about reaching victim survivors in rural areas. I guess I'd start by saying, and I don't think this is unique to advocates in rural settings, but I think it's a good assumption to assume that the clients that you are working with, or the victim survivors that you are working with, that more of them are experiencing exploitation and trafficking than they are disclosing. And to also assume that many members in your community qualify for services around exploitation and trafficking that aren't coming to your organization. And in some ways, when you're working with clients, victim survivors who are not disclosing sexual exploitation and trafficking, that sometimes, that's okay, and that they are working to get their needs met in other ways. So when we're thinking about reaching victim survivors in rural areas, as you all probably know who are working in rural areas, that it can require thinking outside of the box. So you're probably used to that in rural settings, kind of having to think outside the box in many ways. So the first way, I think, to reach victim survivors in rural areas is to really make sure that you have a clear organizational identity to serving trafficking exploitation survivors. So is it in your mission? And do all of your lines of services, if appropriate, are they responsive to trafficking exploitation survivors? Making sure all your staff are trained to recognize the signs, the dynamics, and the response, so you're able to serve your community members. Having a revolving door policy, I think Sarah and Alan kind of talked about this too, how maybe a victim survivor is starting services and then terminates services, but allowing them to come back again when they are ready, if they've terminated services in the past, which I think advocacy agencies are really skilled at doing, but it's particularly important with victim survivors of trafficking and exploitation. Talking about sexual exploitation, trafficking to the people, to the folks you are working with, and calling it out in explicit terms. So we know when we've learned about reproductive coercion or intimate partner sexual violence, that people are less likely to talk about those topics. So I learned as an advocate that I needed to call out explicitly and ask people if they have experienced those sorts of situations. And I think the same is true for trafficking and exploitation. So when you're facilitating a support group or doing a one-on-one with a client, that when you're describing abuse scenarios or giving examples, that you include acts of trafficking and exploitation so they can identify with that and then identify that as something that you can provide services around, and that they can also start to see that as an act of violence too. Being careful who you're screening out of services. So for instance, if somebody is calling seeking shelter and it appears that they're homeless and maybe not experiencing domestic violence or sexual violence, and you start to think, oh, maybe they're not eligible for our services, making sure to ask questions about, like, what is this person doing to survive while they're being homeless? Are they trading sex to get their needs met? Or what led to the situation that made them homeless? And does it have to do with trafficking and exploitation? Setting up connections with folks who are not the usual suspects, so including food shelves, like Sarah mentioned with the risk factors, knowing that drug abuse and being a chronic runaway, having mental health issues are also risk factors, so making sure to connect with those in your community who are dealing with those issues. And lastly, having messaging that includes sexual violence, domestic violence, but also includes exploitation and trafficking, so members in your community know to reach out to you for that.
All right, so I'm going to talk really briefly about response. So you are probably coming into contact with community members and systems professionals who are seeing the same folks that you're seeing in different settings. Survivors of exploitation and trafficking are often requesting services outside of, hey, I've been trafficked. So one of the things that Minnesota's model for responding to exploitation and trafficking has done is to have a no wrong door philosophy, which is to emphasize that however you enter the system of response, you get services. So when we're talking about developing a response protocol, we're talking about, kind of referring back to what Ashley said, connecting with all of those community partners who might be encountering these folks, whether it be people providing safe harbor services, whether it be schools or community services. Healthcare is a huge one. Child protection, juvenile delinquency, that can also be the adult criminal justice system. Law enforcement is having a lot of connections with these folks. And really developing those kind of community systems responses to better respond to these folks who've been involved in exploitation and trafficking. One of the things that we've noticed over the past 5 years of safe harbor work is that these folks don't fit into pre-existing buckets. We have, as for youth, we have child protection and we have juvenile delinquency. And so we've been trying to figure out how to work with youth kind of in one or both of those kind of frameworks. And that doesn't really work very well. In your community, you might also, with domestic violence and sexual violence frameworks, be trying to work with folks who've been exploited or trafficked and having to figure out creatively how to work around those typical frameworks. It really helps to be interconnected with all of those community members who are seeing these individuals, and working on changing the whole system so that you're able to respond better and that victim survivors are getting what they need. Just a brief side note, if you are interested in learning more about community responses and some of the protocol work that we're doing at MNCASA, here are a couple resources that you can find on our website. And then you can also contact me if you have questions.
So a little bit about Safe Harbor statewide services. Just kind of the model is what I'd like to talk about here. The great thing about Minnesota's approach is that it's under the operations of the Minnesota Department of Health. We're talking about that this is a public health situation that we're working with, a crisis of public health. It affects individuals and communities at large. We are all impacted in this. So the model then sets up in terms of how we're going to be able to address the problem of sexual exploitation and sex trafficking by having a statewide director who is driving initiative and policies and ever looking for ways that we might improve our services and expand them. We have regional navigators, 8 of them across the area. It's not a lot, it's a large area, but the regional navigators connect then with community resources to be able to then provide the things that youth may need. And then also there are specialized services in there, supportive services and housing and shelter. So Minnesota really has put together a very a great approach and almost totally comprehensive, as much as you can be comprehensive, considering the different dynamics. It's really looking at the rudimentary issues that are out there. And it's just a great model. So it's good to be working in this state in terms of being able to address the situation. So some of the supportive services include, I'll just call out a couple of them, but I want to kind of also then think outside the box a little bit, because you have this slide in there, you'll be able to kind of refresh your memory by this. Certainly mental health is always an issue, well, almost always an issue that is needed in there. So being able to provide that servicing, quite often you will see chemical dependency issues arising in there. So being connected to those services, support groups, being in a group where there are people experience the same thing instead of somebody looking in from the outside. One of the things that we often don't readily think about too is employment support. If a person is going to be getting out of the life, they need to definitely be able to find a way to meet those basic needs. And so being able to be connecting them with some type of employment support is in there. Drop-in services are great because it's a safe place that they can go to. They're not a lot in rural Minnesota. I'm fortunate enough into one of my larger areas to have a drop-in place that is just phenomenal. And then also then making contact with legal services is a big part of what navigators and what advocates can do too, in being able to provide that person with a connection to navigate through those systems. But outside of that is really, again, taking a look at what are the thinking outside the box. For example, our agency has partnered and provided a kind of what I call an outside of the box resource a person who works on self-care and self-love issues, anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, body image. She also is skilled at stress reduction techniques, dealing with guilt and shame, a sense of identity and agency, relationship issues, and goal setting. All things that you create and support through an environment and a relationship. So supportive services, certainly the Safe Harbor has a number of those, but it's good to be able to think outside of the box as well. And that's really getting into shaping your rural response. Know what your capabilities are, know what the connections are on a statewide level, become connected to them, and then also look and assess what are the resources that you have that may not necessarily be within the very first primary service providers that you go to. But one caveat about that, because these organizations, agencies, or businesses may not know a lot about sex trafficking and exploitation, it is really imperative that you work with them, teach them about the dynamics, prepare and equip them to understand, even just as the simple thing of language is part of it. So look for those outside of the box, but then do what's needed for the person that you're working with by equipping that service provider with the knowledge that you have about the dynamics of sex trafficking and exploitation.
All right, so now we'll have some time. We'll just have a couple minutes here for questions. I'm going to go ahead and unmute the line. So if you want to ask your questions via your computer, via your phone, however you came in. We'll have just a couple of questions here.
Now they're all muted.
I think that might be on their end, where they have to unmute themselves too.
Okay, so I believe that I've unmuted folks. So if you
*6.
Unless you've called in. If you've called in, you'll need to *6 if you'd like to ask questions. So yeah, we'll give you some time if you'd like to chat in your question or ask them here. We'll give you a couple minutes.
Weird.
Okay. Well, we're getting some crickets, but that's okay. I think people get a little bit shy on this type of platform, which is totally fine. But please know that if you have questions after the webinar, that you can certainly contact Sarah, Alan, or I, and we'll make sure to pull up our contact information here. So before we end, I wanted to go through and look at the objectives of the webinar. So you should now be able to describe the dynamics and the violence experienced by victim survivors of trafficking and exploitation in rural spaces. So we did that by going through the methods of recruitment, of control, of initiation and breaking. Identify victim survivors who may be experiencing sex trafficking and exploitation. So we did that by looking at the different risk factors and red flags. Assess your services to sex trafficking and exploitation victim survivors. And that was covered by looking at how to build your response, and also by looking at how to reach victim survivors in rural areas to really think about, is that something that your organization is currently doing, or is that an area where you can grow? And then to list resources available to sex trafficking and exploitation victim survivors. So Alan did that just at the end here, looking at the different resources that are available to sex trafficking and exploitation survivors in rural settings. So with that, we want to thank everybody for attending. We will make this link available to you, or make this webinar available to you afterwards. It was recorded. But again, if you have any questions or want to talk some more after this webinar, please feel free to contact me or Alan or Sarah here. And here's our contact information. All right, okay, well, thanks everybody. And it is about 12:30, so we're gonna go ahead and end this webinar. But again, thank you all for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.